Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to see you all and grateful that you have joined us. I want first to make a land acknowledgement to begin our event. UCI is located on the homelands of the Achiman and Tongva peoples, who in the face of ongoing settler colonialism continue to claim their place and act as stewards of their ancestral lands. I also want to share that this event is being recorded and may be made available on the Center for Medical Humanities website in the near future. My name is Jim Lee, and my pronouns are he, him, and I am the center's director. I want to thank the deans of the Schools of Medicine, Humanities, and the Claire Trevor School of the Arts for their support of the center, as well as members of the community whose support has been so critical and uplifting. I also wanted to thank the center staff for their excellent work in making today's and all of our events possible, Ekua Arhin and Amanda Swain. Thank you for joining us for this Works in Progress event. The Works in Progress series provides faculty and students from around campus the opportunity to showcase their research projects that engage with the intersections of medicine, arts, and the humanities. We especially want to highlight work that the center enthusiastically and materially supports, like Gwen's project that she'll be discussing today. Before I turn this over to Gwen, I want to invite you to join us for our next event. On Thursday, November 10th, we will have two major events. First, Professor Erin Nin will give a presentation titled College Imposters, Model Minority Like Me at 11 a.m. in the Anteater Learning Pavilion 2300. Then later that afternoon, Dr. Mimi Cook will lead us in a workshop titled How Not to Be a Good Student, Asian Americans and Mental Wellness at 4 p.m. in Humanities Gateway 1030. And I will share a link to both events in the chat in a moment. Our presenter today is Gwen Pare, who is a graduate student in UCI Spanish and Portuguese department. She studied political studies and Latin American cultural studies in Spain and the UK before coming to UCI in 2017. In her dissertation, Pare works on the concept of care beyond cure, which Latin American and Caribbean literature offers to apparently incurable horizons. Beginning with Neo-Baroque literature of the 1970s and 80s, she plans to eventually conclude on contemporary feminist virality. Pare enjoys collaborative and experimental work on the boundaries of the university with the arts and activism. And her talk today is titled Derek Walcott's Omeros, The Wound of Slavery in Crafting Resistance. Please join me in welcoming Gwen.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you for the land acknowledgement and giving thanks to the amazing organization of the event. It's such a pleasure to be included in the Work in Progress series. I'm already very grateful for being part of this and hearing whatever you might think, have to comment on the trip. I'm very grateful to have been able to do earlier this year, thanks to the Center for Medical Humanities Summer Grant, and looking forward to the conversation we may have later. And it's great to see some familiar faces from the Spanish department. Thank you so much for making the time to come today. And I remember taking a wonderful class with Ketu Katrak quite a few years ago now, I think. But that I remember we read Walcott in that class at the beginning of that class. So it's wonderful to have you here too. Thank you. So I'm going to read a presentation and show you some images as well. So I wanted to start with some photos, very few impressions of my recent trip to Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in April and May this year. On the one hand, I felt on a personal level, on the one hand, the presence of the past seems completely palpable en route to the archives I visited, with university campuses built on former sugar plantations, as you can see on the photo, as also government grounds or botanical gardens are as well. Both Mona campus of the University of the West Indies based in Kingston, Jamaica, and St. Augustine campus of the same university close to Port of Spain, the capital of Trinidad and Tobago, are on former sugar plantations. On the other hand, the historical moment which I got a sense of in the archives seemed starkly divorced from people, especially younger people I interacted with, admittedly on a superficial level. The archival material seemed divorced from the panorama I witnessed at a literature festival I was lucky to visit, which gathered local and diasporic writers. And the archived material certainly seemed very far away from the newspaper front pages I would see on the street, brandishing measures against the high cost of living or crime, for example. And although I went to Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago for archival research, of course, these islands are very well accustomed to tourism and tourists who look like me. And while I did a little bit of visiting, I did see how the inner cities of Kingston, Spanish Town, Kentish Town, Port Antonio, and so on are polished up for foreign visitors' cameras to make foreign visitors feel comfortable and safe in these cities. A great example, I think, is Woodford Square, where the Black Power uprisings were in the 1970s in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, which now is a very serene, almost sanitized space in inner city Port of Spain. When I researched about Kamau E. Brathwaite on the right of the slide and Derek Walcott on the left from abroad, it was very easy to read about the antagonism or contrast between the two authors. Both lived in different countries to their native Barbados for Brathwaite and St. Lucia for Walcott. But Brathwaite lived and worked in Ghana as well and was committed to African Caribbean solidarity and Black power in the region. Walcott, on the other hand, was suspicious of nostalgic references to Africa and said some very unpopular or untimely things about Black power in the Caribbean. For example, a newspaper article titled "A Revolution Based on Race is Suicidal," and many more statements of the kind from a very controversial figure. But there are good reasons to suspect of this story, which centers on two men's differences, and good reasons, I think, to delve deeper into the tissue of the argument, both engaged beyond personal opinions or biography. Perhaps most importantly, because this story caricaturizes both authors, but also because other voices are left out of this story. For example, Marlene Nobizi Phillip, to whom I turn later in the dissertation chapter, though not today, is one of the Afro-Caribbean voices of almost the same generation who is neglected or left out of that story, which pits Walcott and Brathwaite against one another. So in seeking to gain a sense of the moment that both Walcott and Brathwaite shared, but also Nobizi Phillip, I was very excited to visit archives in Kingston and St. Augustine campuses of the University of the West Indies for newspaper materials, literary manuscripts, notes of theatre rehearsals, among others, in order to gain a better understanding of the specificities of Blackness in post-coloniality as it was experienced and especially discussed in the years and decades leading up to the big poetry books that I'm studying in my dissertation. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago are the two countries in the English-speaking Caribbean where Black power uprisings were strongest. And after all, the supposed antagonism between Brathwaite and Walcott hinges on Blackness and the relation to colonial language. But for that reason, race as a concept and an experience in the Caribbean is not self-evident from today's perspective. So I'm thinking of David Scott's important book, Conscripts of Modernity, which began influencing my work on chapter 2 of the dissertation long before I knew this chapter existed. I want to take on Scott's challenge, which he describes early in that book. I quote, "Post-colonial critics have sometimes assumed that the questions to which the anti-colonial nationalists addressed themselves, questions about their presence and their connections to their past and their hoped for futures, were the same as the ones that organized their own contemporary concerns and preoccupations," end quote. Scott warns us that as readers, one shouldn't simply assume that we share the questions which anti-colonial movements posed and compare the historical answers with one's own rear mirror view. Instead, Scott stipulates a difference between the questions that animated former presence and those that animate our own. In a way, he's suggesting that the ways in which questions are formulated are already indicative of a diagnosis of the present, which we shouldn't skip in moving to evaluating the answers from our present perspective. So in summary, or in short, Scott writes that I quote, historicizing past hopes, such as anti-colonial ones, ought to entail an analysis less of the transformative projects themselves than of the way those hopes reflect a certain understanding of the problem to be overcome, end quote. From Scott's work, then, I take an impulse to study the varying understandings of the problems to be overcome, rather than comparing Brathwaite's and Walcott's answers to historical problems and measuring them against ours. I begin by asking, what if we focus on the tensions between them, for example, on Blackness, as a question to a particular moment of Caribbean post-colonial history? What if these different questions then shed light on how variously the problem of post-coloniality in the Caribbean was understood, and thus how variously we still stand to read those historical problems and their afterlives today? As some scholars have acknowledged, Walcott and Brathwaite respected one another and learned from one another a lot. One of these scholars is Timothy J. Rice, who worked with Brathwaite at NYU, or Ian Jenkins, who calls the opposition between Walcott and Brathwaite tired. There was clearly much contact and not even ginger proximity between the two, and I'm only one of many readers of their poetry who are focusing increasingly on the contact between the two. In my dissertation, I'm specifically interested in how this interaction is manifested in their poetic practice, and then in turn, how both authors' poetic practice molds the questions they pose to Caribbean post-colonial history. Although Walcott was the poet to receive more cosmopolitan recognition, I suggest that Walcott's most renowned poetry, in Omeros, works with what we might call Brathwaite's toolbox. This shared toolbox can help us shed light on the role which popular culture played in their aim to write poetry for Caribbean post-colonies. Among the Walcott papers held at the special collections at the University of the West Indies Mona campus at Kingston, Jamaica, I read, for example, a late 60s review of Brathwaite's Rites of Passage, which Walcott writes full of appreciation for what he called Brathwaite's pure technique. Walcott acknowledges the superb rigidity and discipline of Brathwaite's techniques, but at the same time, their roots in popular orality. He writes, I quote, "There are several sequences from Mr. Brathwaite's imposing trilogy, Rites of Passage, which are instinctually theatrical, and which in their precise compression of various island dialects, in their swift delineation of character through the music of speech, are as dramatic as the more direct work of other West Indian playwrights," end quote. Walcott goes out of his way to acknowledge the technical mastery of The Dust, a long poem which presents us with two women's dialogue, remembering a traumatic event before their lifetimes, the eruption of a volcano. This dialogue is written in Creole, or what Brathwaite calls nation language being an anti-colonial literary project which works on and with and against colonial English to repurpose it for different locales and for contestatory politics. Gabrielle Belleau writes of The Dust as a captivating evocation of what Brathwaite called nation language, or critic and poet Velma Pollard even calls The Dust a tribute to the folk, which we might also call a tribute to popular culture today. So it's interesting what Walcott remarks about Brathwaite's Creole poem, since he remarks both its popular feminine orality and the techniques proper to this orality, even before it is fashioned into poetry. Walcott insists that Brathwaite was neither writing a play in The Dust, nor wrote a stagey poem, emphasizing a theatrical quality to the orality the poem presents to us. Walcott continues, I quote, "The libretto comes out of speech itself," end quote. To Walcott, then, Brathwaite's poetry puts onto a poetic stage something inherently theatrical about popular and everyday speech in the Caribbean. In her brilliant analysis of the formal possibilities of Creole, Rhonda Cobham Sanders, who's worked at the same archives and organized conferences at the University of the West Indies to commemorate Walcott, for example, confirms these analyses. I don't have this quote on the slide. So Cobham Sanders says of the women in dialogue that their insight into the contingent nature of an existence without rhyme, without reason, comes to us paradoxically, she says, via the poems oral technique. Walcott's appreciation of Brathwaite's techniques indicates an approach to the political purposes which orality served for Brathwaite. But it also means that the author, who was considered in Europe to have mastered classical English from a far-flung colony, as Walcott was and is sometimes still described, enters the scripted street corner into the Nobel Prize winning Omeros too, thanks to Brathwaite's earlier work. According to Cobham Sanders, Brathwaite's The Dust becomes a moral model for orality in Walcott's Omeros. We should keep in mind then that to Walcott, The Dust is a model in popular orality and in popular technique. In fact, the two work in tandem for him. Tracing a development towards Afro-Caribbean orality or towards nation language, Cobham Sanders suggests that Walcott's appropriation of Brathwaite's technique culminates in Sea Grapes from 1976, when Walcott no longer translates between French and English-based Creole and their classic vernaculars, as we'll see shortly in the dialogue. Thematically, too, orality had begun to preoccupy Walcott earlier, still in the 70s, as Ray Tirada points out regarding Walcott's 1973 Another Life, and that it evokes an entire neighborhood with different social strata, voices, idiolects, and languages. On a formal level, then we can see that a shared interest in Caribbean orality as a technical, theatrical experience subtends the differences between Walcott and Brathwaite. And yet, in Brathwaite's emphatic search for native syllables and rhythms, language doesn't correspond to a given reality, but approaches reality as a question. Brathwaite's search for native syllables rhymes, we could say, with the search for autonomous speech in Latin America by the likes of César Vallejo and Alejo Carpentier. But neither Brathwaite nor Walcott, neither Vallejo nor Carpentier, seek autonomy in realist language. In my dissertation, I argue that in an overlooked convergence with Latin American canons of unrealism, whether it be called magical realism, surrealism, Baroque, Teatro Mundi, etc., Caribbean thinkers like Edouard Glissant, Derek Walcott, Wilson Harris, and others argue that literary and dramatic techniques are needed to make sense of an unhinged, wounded reality. While Brathwaite's The Dust works its way up to the memory of the volcano erupting, news of neighbors and children's sickness are the messengers of the suffering to come to a head cataclysmically in the eruption of the volcano. Similarly to how we read of syphilis later in a later poem, Middle Passages by Brathwaite from 1992, the pestilence in the present poem, In the Dust, is a vague evocation of multitudinous suffering and a condition of the present associated with the pest or a plague, a highly transmissible and hardly isolable crisis beseeching a community apparently without rhyme or reason. So there is a sense in which a wounded reality converges with a reality under question in the authors I'm studying, a reality which needs to be approached with all the wits and devices of literary experimentalism. It's in this context that I draw your attention to how The Dust ends with questions. And suddenly so, without rhyme, without reason, all your hope gone, everything looked like it coming out wrong. Why is that? What it mean? End quote. As Walcott seems to appreciate in his review, the poem The Dust by Brathwaite merely stages an already present question for the figures and techniques of sense-making with which Caribbean orality busies itself. There is nothing essential about Brathwaite's uprooted, self-confabulating New World popular. And yet the fact that a traumatic event is delivered in popular Creole speech, in Brathwaite's nation language, is part and parcel of how the problem, everything looks like it's coming out wrong, is posed. The women's nation language drama knows and teaches that things keep turning out wrong despite abolition, despite formal independence, because of a gratuitous violence like the volcanic eruption, remembered in gossip as relentless as divine punishment. So in the longer poem, in the only poetic repetitions of this kind, the volcano is described as black, 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 and the data is described as it went dark, dark, dark. Blackness and darkness are so emphatically repeated in the description of the volcano that the seemingly senseless volcanic eruption contaminates what the women's dialogue teaches us about race. Its gratuitous working, its inheritance impinging on the present, its transmissibility in colonial and post-colonial governmental actions like the pestilence. In Omeros, the wound, like the eruption of the volcano in the dust, is a traumatic experience. Trauma in Greek, of course, means injury, but I don't pretend to analyze this literary work by explaining it through recourse to a historical injury. Why? Most of all, because the injury at stake in Omeros is too tentacular and mobile to refer to one single event. In Omeros, the wound is one of many references to the Odyssey and the Iliad, Helen, Troy, Achilles, Hector, war, pride, and many being some among many other themes that echo Homeric poetry. The wound echoes Philoctetes' banishment from the Greek military fighting in the Trojan War, and his resentment incarnated in the incurable wound. But in Walcott's Omeros, the wound is a figure of the presence of Caribbean history, of a Caribbean past and the present, of afterlives. The wound is inflicted by the anchor of a boat and by association by the slave ship. It is cut in other passages by colonialism and slavery. It inhabits language. The wound at different times in the poem extends to the island's geography, to the history of the Middle Passage, to post-colonial pain, to language, and moves from protagonist to protagonist. In these ways, the wound is an intriguing plot line subtending the more noticeable plot lines like the triangle of love between Hector, Achilles, and Helen, or like Major Plunkett's colonial nostalgia. Whereas the plot portrays mainly young men in post-colonial St. Lucia dealing with the tribulations of work, tourism, independence, travel. The wound, on the other hand, dogs the plot line of the poem in a kind of haunting, repetitive quality. It's been there for hundreds of years before the poem Omeros begins or is set, and it feels as if it may outlast the voices in the poem. The wound thus presents us with a condition of inhabiting a present now past, a condition carved by the present, and yet the shapes given to the wound, its changing contours, its transformations, set in motion forms of survival, surviving forms which do not simply reflect a biographical or historical event, but instead continue to give shape and form to a trauma insofar as it's not safely anchored in the past, but presses on the present and insofar as the present continues to rewrite the past. Perhaps most curiously to me, as I study Omeros, there is an attachment to and even defense of the wound. We hear this defensive identification with the wound explicitly Late in the poem, when the poet's alter ego reflects on, I quote, the wound of a language I'd no wish to remove, end quote. This ambivalent wound is also described as a radiant affliction, which carries its own cure. As I've said, Walcott takes the dialogue from Brathwaite, which is inspired in popular orality. This is crucial for me when in the chapter, I look at an absolutely, in my opinion, riveting dialogue in Omeros, which shows how by the time that Omeros was awarded the Nobel Prize, Brathwaite's technique is fully ensconced in Walcott's poetry. The dialogue I'm about to show and read with you is one of the first introductions of the wound in the poem. It puts on scene the theatre of everyday oral speech and its questions to the rhyme and reason of reality, like the dust. The dialogue masterfully puts an everyday oral speech on stage before reality as a question or an obstacle. Like when Scott invites us to examine, I quote, the way those hopes reflect a certain understanding of the problem to be overcome, end quote. I think it's central to the problem how it is reflected in poetry, and thus the creolizing forms in which the dialogue is presented are part and parcel of the question. In the dialogue, Philoctete is asked to explain or give an account of his affliction. He's asked by Mark Hillman, a matriarchal presence in the town who both runs a corner store and guards ancestral medical and ritual knowledge, not unlike the baby shugs of Toni Morrison's Beloved. The exchange is on screen, but I also wanted to share with you a recording of Walcott reading these lines. You could just give me one tiny moment. We'll just listen to 15 seconds of this beautiful long poem. Oh, can you hear the sound? Sorry for that.
And anoint the mouth of the sore on his shin. Mais qui ça qui reveal, Philoctete? Me blessé. But what is wrong with you, Philoctete? I am blessed with this wound, Makilman, qui paka jewi pièce, which will never heal. Well,
In this remarkable passage, Philoctete lays out his paradoxical injury. A number of creolizing translations, mistranslations accentuate the paradoxical wound. For instance, wrong or wrongedness consists in the incurable wound, blessure, Philoctete suffers, which is also the blessing, I am blessed, which singles him out. Qui ça qui rive où, Philoctete? We might translate it as what has happened to you, already a mistranslation, right? But the English correspondence in the text equates events with being wrong or wronged. Next, the slippage between the French blessé, French or Creole blessé, hurt, injured, point to a problematic singularity where chosenness and hurtness are collapsed. The English, which will never heal, is a foreclosure of future healing, but in French, the future time is even more conflicted. Une blessure qui pièce à ne pas guérir, une blessure qui pas qu'à guérir pièce. In this phrase, which we might mistranslate as a wound which hurries not to heal, the insistence of the wound and its healing are in direct conflict. There seems to be within the wound a drive which resists healing, hurries not to heal. So in the wound, there is a memory of a colonial legacy, which saturates the present with the past, but strains against being assimilated, stubbornly staying open against attempts to close it in what we might infer as a suspiciously eyed health. Like the volcano in the dust, as senseless and threatening as the pest, it matters that the wound is introduced as incurable in a theatricalized Creole dialogue. Terada had written about Walcott's Creole, I quote, that the interpenetration of languages is recognized as normative. So interpenetrating languages are normative, constitutive of language itself. The above passage, ricocheting between French and English, Creole and normative French and English, erased the line between translation and poetic creolization, showcasing how they interpenetrate. Thus, the dialogue calls attention to an orality, but also reflects on its theatricalization of this orality. The dialogue on an incurable wound points to something oral speech does, knows, teaches, like the women's dialogue in the dust. What I think the wound in Omeros teaches us in brief is about a Caribbean orality which is constantly coding and recoding in creolizing halls of mirrors. An orality thus conceived as neither essentially Caribbean, not even Afro-Caribbean, nor is it transparent as a political project, but it keeps the secret in this play of mistranslations in the historical way which Edouard Glissant attributes to the plantation matrix of Afro-Caribbean orality and literature in Poétique de la Relation. In a last review newspaper piece I wanted to share from the archive, I wanted to get to Walcott's Politics Adrift. So clearly it's important that the wound in Omeros resists something, but it's also unlike the bravery, militancy, or heroism of some avant-gardes of nation language or Black power under whose impression Walcott clearly also worked. In Omeros, in marked contrast to Homeric poetry, Philoctete is an abject protagonist, jobless, destitute, old, and lonely, supported by the solidarity of his neighborhood. He is adrift, a small hero at best. There is nothing in Philoctete or Hector and Achille, there is nothing very impressive about Walcott's small heroes, and there is no martyrdom about the wound which hurries not to heal. Instead, Walcott's wounded post-colonial present is ambivalent in the aftermath of nation, language, and Black power uprisings. This ambivalence may and absolutely did disappoint political allegiances, but in the small heroes of Omeros and the abjection of Philoctete, I think the ambivalence is at least not aloof to popular Caribbean culture, but perhaps as motley, wavering, and heterogeneous as it itself is. And this seems to be an important understanding of the problem to be overcome that we can maintain as we read poetry from that time. As Walcott discussed in an interview with Louis Bourne in 1999, drift is the hero of Omeros, like the untethered wound which moves between people but does not settle on any closure or normative health. Omeros doesn't have a single hero, but instead gives voice to drifters and common folk. In the interview, which I'm going to have to read out to you, Walcott explains, I quote, "If one had to choose a hero, you say at one point it is the drifter, and maybe it's an epic that has several small heroes in a way, and one searching consciousness," end quote. Critics have rightly pointed out that Achille and Hector are focused on, perhaps at the expense of Helen, the main female character. But all of these men whose inner depths are explored are not heroic. They are adrift, often full of questions, often struggling, sometimes wounded. They come close to what Earl Lovelace had to say about rude boys in Walcott's play O Babylon. This is Earl Lovelace, who still lives in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. If Walcott's Omeros is interested in small heroes or drifters, His interest in theatre plays and poetry has consistently been directed to drifters and small heroes, including those who swelled the tide of Black Power mobilizations when it rose in solidarity with Marcus Garvey in Jamaica in 1968 and in Trinidad and Tobago's February Revolution in 1970. The protests originated on university campuses like the ones I was lucky to visit, but they wouldn't have made a dent on national politics had they not also drawn a wide variety of people to their protests, often young and unemployed people, obviously young and old, to join the rallies. The rude boys in song and on the streets, which musically prepared a fertile ground for Black Power movements, was like the groundswell where reggae was the politicized tip of the iceberg. Brian Meeks, who was a witness and participant in these movements, writes, I quote, if rock steady, the beat of the rude boys with its slow, deliberate rhythm was a portent of a broader mass rebellion, then reggae, its far more famous successor, whose history is almost parallel to the rise of Black Power, was from its origins rebel music, end quote. In novels like Is Just a Movie, Salt, or The Dragon Can't Dance, Trinbaghian author Al Lovelace is perhaps one of the most astute readers and companions of the questions Walcott seems to be asking in Omros with the wound, although Lovelace doesn't always sound like he's satisfied. He's not acritical, quite the contrary. In a stunning review, one of my favorite pieces I read in the archives, Lovelace reviews Walcott's 1976, O Babylon, which stages a Babylon, an urban morass and confusion rather than a revolutionary fervor or tragedy. In Rastafarianism, of course, Babylon refers to a corrupted capitalist neo-colonial world that righteous believers are trying to escape. But Walcott's play, O Babylon, leaves no one unscathed, neither the Jamaican politicians, like Michael Manley seeking popularity by donning Rastafarian names, nor the idealistic Rastafarians who shunned the dread politics of accommodation or assimilation, nor anyone in between. Lovelace understands that the heroes of Walcott's O Babylon are not the Rastafarians with their idealism and untainted dream of Africa, but the almost picaresque rude boy. Lovelace asks, with seeming incredulity, I quote, can Walcott be proposing rude boy Dawson, the Ginnell, the hustler, the unbeliever, the one who continues in the same dimension of his existence from peanut vendor to reggae star? Rude boy Dawson, the amuser, the survivor, the chance grabber, is the one that got away, rather that survives. One sees two sets of dreams now, the Rastafarian's dream and rude boy's dreams. Yet like the politician who is by no means his moral inferior, rude boy may well ask, and why not, rude boy? Yeah, why not? Why not? In the end, this is the answer the play provides, end quote. Lovelace's lackadaisical conclusion, in which he obviously says the answer the play provides as a question, in my opinion, hits the nail on the head of Walcott's oblique and wavering allegiance to Black Power. So of course, why not answers in the form of a question, but it is an only superficially opportunistic answer to the question of political dreams, which quickly reveals itself to be a crucial reminder of the dreams of the multitudinous dreams adrift in 1970s Jamaica, as in other places where none could be given priority to the other. In pitting the Rastafarian's dream and rude boy's dreams against one another in O Babylon, perhaps at stake is not a cynical dismissal of people who are sellouts in different ways, but ways in which Walcott's highly ambivalent and suspicious theatre writing and poetry gets at the heterogeneity and variety of understandings of Blackness as a problem when the Black Power movement rose. Whereas Walcott as an author may have got political cause wrong in his day, the multivocality of his plays and poetry are perhaps not only a good reflection on the political movements of the time, but they also open the prism of anti-colonial questions being asked, problems being defined in the heterogeneous movements of Black power in newly independent states like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you. Thanks for your attention and patience.
Thank you, Gwen. We have about 10-15 minutes if folks want to either use the chat or unmute themselves and ask a question or raise a comment in response to Gwen's presentation. And we're a small enough community that you don't need to raise your hand. You can just unmute yourself or use the chat.
Hello, Gwen. Great to see you with this work. Thank you so much for the presentation. I liked how you paired Brathwaite and Walcott in the beginning and kind of tried to parse out, you know, some of the techniques, in fact, that Brathwaite used that then Walcott imbibed in Omeros. I don't think that's very widely known. So I think that's wonderful that you brought that up. I still had, you know, questions about Walcott's political position, which I think you do too, and that's been an issue throughout. So whether it is, you know, I mean, it's very telling that he got the Nobel Prize and not Brathwaite, right? I mean, Brathwaite did a lot of important work and made, you know, very important interventions, but he is very clearly takes the political stand, which Nobel Prizes often don't endorse. So in terms of race itself, you know, I wonder if you could say some more. And also the fact that you talked about the wound, right? That would also the different translations, which you showed very beautifully, if it would never heal or if it's in the process of healing. But Walcott typically is not interested in that. He does not want to go to the other side, you know, whether the wound will heal and there will be different kind of resistance or whatever, you know. So let me leave it there for you to just address whatever part you like. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I just wanted to say to anyone, if you have questions, I'm very grateful to receive them, but also if you have comments about anything you've just seen or read on the presentation, or if you know the authors, I speak way too little about Walcott and Brathwaite, so it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts, even if they're very open. And I will try and answer some or both of your questions, and thank you very much, Ketu. I don't have a definitive answer, but while and Walcott, as I'm sure you've all heard in the presentation, is an extremely controversial figure. I try and separate his work from that quite a bit, just because it's very noisy how controversial he was. But while I think it's true that his work makes a trajectory which approaches Afro-Caribbean culture, stops disavowing it, basically, as one might read that happening in earlier works of his. And I think that is pared back over the course of his trajectory, not to the extent that you just described for Brathwaite. But one thing I think is very strong and very just something interesting to stay with, or for me at least to think about, is that Walcott has his, or at least in my understanding, seems to have real scruples about idealizing a return to Africa. But his ideation of race in the Caribbean and as a modern experience, basically, with all the so-called East Indian influences that especially Trinidad and Tobago has, for example. In that sense, for example, I think it's just fascinating that when he receives the Nobel Prize, which I agree was a political stance of the Nobel Prize Committee to take for Walcott and against Brathwaite. In the acceptance speech that Walcott presents, he speaks about, I've forgotten the name, he speaks about a festival, which I think is Rimala, I've forgotten the name. He speaks about an Indian festival in Trinidad and Tobago and speaks about that for a couple of minutes, completely deflecting what the white audience at the Nobel Prize award might be expecting to hear about currying to English as a colonial language, or maybe shocking the audience with an Afro-Caribbean. And I think that speaks very well to how he's very interested in race as a modern, Caribbean, urban, complicated story. And with that, with that come a lot of the controversies that we've been speaking about already. And then as far as the wound is concerned, I don't think I should have mentioned that for those who maybe haven't read Omeros yet, that there is a scene in which the wound is cured by Mark Hillman, quite towards the end of the poem, if I remember correctly. There's a ritual scene in which there is kind of a revelation or a re-memory of knowledge is lost. And that's how Mark Hillman does end up curing Philoctet. But I still think it's a very interesting motricity or drive of the wound that it itself doesn't want to let go of Philoctet, for example, among other protagonists. And I think that is a resistance to assimilating a certain post-colonial account, which continues to be disruptive in very interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Yeah, the festival might be the Ram Leela. The Ram
Thank
Leela.
you. Sorry for forgetting the name.
Okay. Yeah, and I was also, just as a follow-up, you don't have to answer it, in terms of Walcott's dramas, and how they might have a role to play in this sort of positioning, because I know Dream on Monkey Mountain, and again, the ritual that you mentioned at the end of Omeros, you get a lot of evocations of that also in the drama. Thank you.
Hi, so I want to thank you again, Gwen, for your wonderful presentation. I am not myself very familiar with the work of these poets. I am a little bit more familiar with Brathwaite's, one of his works. And what I was very interested in a question that you proposed of what kind of language is needed to speak of and about a wounded reality. I was thinking, because you obviously highlight the orality of these two poets. And I was thinking if you're including, for me, Brathwaite's poetry, it's still very visual. So when you are reading it, the different fonts, all the images within the poems for me is like, you have to be not just the orality, but also visually engaged with a poem in a way that it's not normally done with other poetry. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I'm wondering if you're including the visual aesthetics of I don't know if Walcott's poets had shared similar visual effects as Brathwaite's, or if that's something that you are incorporating or have thought about in your project as well. You're muted.
Sorry, I somehow lost the unmute button. I'm so sorry. But thanks for that fascinating question. And I think, as far as I know, but maybe others know more, as far as I know, Walcott doesn't experiment very much with font or different sizes of font or page layout in his poetry, as far as I know. Not so much in any case as Brathwaite does. That's just as far as I know, but I think the visuality of Brathwaite's poetry is completely fascinating. And I think there are interviews with him, or he explains it as being very intimately bound with there being an intimate connection between orality and visuality as a kind of performative experience, rather than an individual reader sits down and reads Brathwaite's lines left to right, top to bottom. And this is moving away a little bit from the wound, but what I think is fascinating about how Brathwaite describes these visual effects is that he calls it the Sycorax video style, if I'm not mistaken. And he moves to this when he, after becoming a bit disappointed with how nation language is co-opted or absorbed into canonized. And so he moves to Sycorax video style, and with that, I'm really trying to think about a care beyond the cure under the sign of Sycorax. There are some stunning poems in which he visualizes the X, and this happens in a number of different poems. And the X, of course, takes us back to Sycorax, but it's kind of a presence of a silence on the page. It's a big letter in these poems. It's very pronounced, but it can't be read. If you then, I think at least if you go through the poetry, there doesn't seem to be a kind of lexical or thematic pattern between the X's, and instead it's a visual presence of the silence which can't be recovered. And there is still a custodianship or a care which is being practiced or experimented with in this visuality, even if it can't be produced into a verbal word or written word, because some silences can't be recovered. Thank you for the question.
If I may assert directorial privilege and ask a slightly kind of bird's eye question, in thinking through your phrase "care beyond cure," I wonder if in your kind of research you have kind of developed a kind of theory of reading practice that informs the way you engage these authors. And here I'm kind of going back to thinking of what medical humanities is trying to do kind of broadly, is to kind of, in thinking through an analogous kind of intention in literary criticism of there's a tendency in both medicine and in literary criticism to kind of take on criticism as a form of diagnostic or diagnosis. And I wonder if you are trying to sort of offer a different kind of reading practice through what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, I wish, but I think I'm still working on that. Thanks for that description of the challenge, which I definitely think is very important. And from what I've read of your book, Wounded Pedagogies, I think that is a model in practicing, looking for a different reading practice. And I try and get at that through some psychoanalytic readings, where I'm thinking of symptoms as forms, and how, at least in psychoanalytic texts or theories, symptoms are a call for attention. They're an excessive call for attention, even beyond their normative diagnosis or maybe even cure eventually. But then there has to be a moment of attention and of reading the symptom on its own terms, at least in psychoanalytic theory, because there is no skipping that attention and that relationship. What that means practically is only at the moment, though, is only that I try and read images of woundedness or injury or in contagion and so on their own terms, trying to figure out how they're working as dynamics, because they often seem to, or at least in the text that I happen to find fascinating, they seem to move a text along, whether that's a contagion which really makes the text fall apart, come apart at its seams, or whether it's the wound that is moving through Omeros, they seem to develop a dynamic of their own, which is where I'm trying to at least begin studying these images of illness on their own terms. But thank you for the question, because it's one I will keep asking myself.
Well, thank you for the generosity of your presentation and your time. I know that it's late for you, so I appreciate it very much. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for spending time with our center. And I look forward to seeing you at future events. Be well and take care, everyone.